Greetings, history lovers. Dr. Philip Travis here. YouTube channel History Changes. And I'm at a place, this is a park in Rome. We're on the Opium Hill. Across the way, you can see the Roman Colosseum, and just beyond that would be the Palatine Hill, where the palaces of Augustus and so forth are, and below it is the Roman Forum. And this is a park. It's a nice park. It's a great place to relax when you're in Rome, but it actually hides a really incredibly fascinating site. And I think one of the sites that most people that travel to Rome don't know about and probably miss and never do. And you should really do it because it's an incredible thing to behold. Below the earth here is one of the most extraordinary sights that you can see when it comes to ancient history. The brick buildings over here are the baths of the Emperor Tyrant, who was emperor, I believe, in the 3rd century, the 200s, I believe. Again, back there is the Roman Colosseum. The Colosseum was built by the Flavian dynasty right after the last of the Julio-Caludian dynasty, which ended with Nero, who I'm about ready to talk about. The Colosseum, by the way, was completed around about the time, it should be noted, when Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried, Mount Vesuvius, south near Naples, to give you a little context of the time frame. So we're talking about 79 CE or AD for that event, Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius and Herculaneum. But buried behind me is the Domus Aurea, but for our purposes is the palace of the Emperor Nero. Nero was the last of the Julio-Caludian emperors. They were the emperors who claimed a direct link to the Emperor Augustus. After the Roman fire of AD 64, CE 64, after the Roman fire, this area, the buildings of this area all burned, and Nero had built a magnificent palace. It was called the Domus Aurea. And when you walk down this way, you go to the right and you can enter. It's hard to find the entrance sometimes. But because it was buried, ultimately, so this palace was built by Nero, but then a century and a half afterwards, the Emperor Tyrant, who built these baths, had it buried. He thought the palace was no longer useful. They buried it with dirt and rubble. In effect, it had kind of the same effect that Pompeii had, even though Pompeii in 79 CE was buried by a volcanic eruption. This was buried intentionally by people. And so this palace of Nero's great palace was left really undiscovered and unknown until the 1500s, where it was discovered by Renaissance artists. Well, if you go in through the front, you enter, you get a tour, and the tour will show you underground, this incredible palace, halls, the former bottom floor of the baths of Titus, incredible frescoes on the wall, the remnants of this tremendous palace. And at the end of it, they even give you a virtual reality tour with a virtual reality mask. You can imagine exactly what this would have been like in all of its splendor. Nero, of course, died in 68 CE or AD. He was overthrown and ousted from power, forced effectively to commit suicide. But the preservation of this structure is amazing. When it was discovered at the early period of the Renaissance in the 1500s, great painters like Raphael, for example, it was discovered by happenstance, got cave underground. They went through the ground into the space to ultimately, with torches and a little sunlight, discover magnificent frescoes that were preserved and remained on the walls and the ceilings. It actually inspired the Renaissance artists, because Renaissance means rebirth. They very much wanted to go back and to reimagine the stylings of antiquity. And it created a whole new form of artwork called the grotesque, which comes from the Roman word grotto, underground chamber. So it really inspired Renaissance artists. They got direct inspiration from the exact art that was created in this palace of Nero, which was buried. Now, a little bit more for analysis for historians and history lovers here to think about here. We always need to be critical thinkers. Nero, was he a great leader? Probably not. However, Nero's an interesting case because Nero, on the one hand, he behaved in ways that the status quo political establishment at the time, and Nero is the ruler of Rome from 54 CE or AD to 68, but he engaged in behaviors that his mother was Agrippina, the great-granddaughter of Augustus. And he behaved in practices in ways that were considered to be unfitting for a noble, for an emperor. He was a poet, he was a musician, he was an artist, and he liked to ride in chariot races. This made him incredibly popular with the people. He was kind of like a populist leader. The people loved him, the status quo hated him. Ultimately, over time, groups like the Flavians and authors like Cassius Dio, they would write about Nero, but they wrote about it from their perspective. And in a lot of ways, it was really propaganda. So it's really important for us to be critical thinkers as historians, because the way we think about Nero, the common way we think about Nero, often comes through the lens of propaganda, i.e., the most notorious of which, blaming Nero for the fire of Rome, which decimated Rome, burned for days and days. Nero probably wasn't even in Rome at the time. Undoubtedly, it was wrong to blame him for it, but he was blamed for this fire. After the fire, of course, he builds this great palace. But Nero himself, a very problematic leader in many respects. But there's a lot of propaganda to make Nero out for maybe being more of a terrible person or a terrible leader than perhaps he was. And a lot of that was owed to propaganda that was perpetuated after his death and during his life. He was overthrown. And eventually, this, in about a year's time, led to the rise of the Flavians. Nero remained popular with the people. And in fact, there were even instances of uprisings and rebellions of individuals who claimed to actually be Nero, that Nero hadn't died. And so Nero was an example of like a tyrant, a Roman populist leader that very much offended the desires of the aristocracy. And eventually, when the economy began to turn south, because Nero had to raise taxes following the Roman fire, they had to devalue the currency. This led from one phase to another to a brief civil war that led to his ouster and his ultimate fleeing of Rome and his ultimate suicide. But when we're historians, we want to think critically. We want to consider what are the sources, where are they coming from, and what are their perspectives. And a lot of our common knowledge about Nero comes from the perspective of those who effectively were, lack of a better way of saying it, on the side of those who ousted him. So below this park, a great palace of Nero, which really shows you the splendor of the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasties, and tells us a story not only about incredibly elaborate and lavish and excessive lifestyle of Nero and emperors at this time, but also tells us a little bit about how maybe we should think about remembering how we remember Nero in his position in Roman imperial history. So here we are. I know it doesn't look like much, the entrance to the Domus Aurea, the palace of Nero. Of course, you have to remember it was buried in dirt for 1900 years, 1800 years. But let's go inside and see what we have in store. Inside the Domus Aurea, you see this is a replication. It's not a real waterfall, but there would have actually used to have been a waterfall here in Nero's palace, which of course was destroyed. All these walls would have been covered with marble. They were removed after it was destroyed and buried following his ouster. And you look over here and you can see the vaulted dome ceiling. The dome would not have had marble on it. There are some theories that actually there would have been a structure in there. If you see the holes up here that had a kind of a facade that might have rotated, and this may have been the dining room. But all these walls have been covered by marble. Here in the Domus Aurea, Nero's palace, the last of the Julio-Claudian leaders. So if we come over here, I want to show you this. You can see what the ceiling would have looked like. See this piece, how the ceiling would have looked here at Nero's palace. Down here as you walk through the hall, and you look over here and how the floors would have looked, well preserved. These are inside the baths. Inside the baths portion that became incorporated into the Baths of Titus. These are the rooms, the walls are decorated. Amazingly well preserved because of less light being exposed. And you can see various depictions of a fake window right here, drawing of a deer right here. If I can zoom in, maybe we can see the deer. And this was part of the original palace of Nero, though it wasn't known as such for years when it was discovered, because it was part of the Baths of Titus, so it was assumed this was the basement of the Baths of Titus. Probably too cold to be down here in the winter. Again, the Baths of Titus, the main hall. Imagine you're walking into these baths and you see public baths were very important in Roman culture. You notice the depictions on the walls, the paint, incredibly well preserved. The more it is exposed to air, the more it degrades, so some of these must be restored. This room, which was the Golden Room, discovered first by the Renaissance painters, and you see the holes. This is where they came down. This is the only place they came down into this room, which was all buried almost to the top. And if you can recall, if you can imagine, this, which is buried in dirt, used to look out, opening across the palatial complexes of Rome, of ancient Rome. All the temples and everything, if you can imagine,